Well, for a closer look at the retail industry, let's bring in Jason Goldberg via Skype. He's Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at the advertising and PR firm Publicis Group. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy holidays.
Thank you, and to you too. So, people obviously out there shopping or not shopping anymore. So, talk about the ways that the pandemic has changed the way that people shop and really what they've been prioritizing in their 2020 purchases.
Sure. So it certainly has been an unprecedented holiday season. Well, it's very atypical, and for retailers, there's a lot more uncertainty. But in general, some categories are considerably up. So people are spending a lot more money on groceries as they're, of course, going to restaurants less. People are spending a lot more money on home improvement and do-it-yourself items as they're traveling less. We actually see auto sales are slightly up, which is interesting. And then sporting goods is a category that's doing really well as people are obviously going to gyms less.
Now, it's interesting because we did see a lot of bankruptcies in the retail sector in 2020. So will these bankruptcies continue into 2021? And was this inevitable even without the pandemic?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do think we're going to see a lot of bankruptcies continue into next year. In the United States, in general, we're heavily overstored. We have about 24 square feet of space for every man, woman, and child for shopping. And compare that to someplace like Europe, which has about 4 square feet of retail space per person. So a lot of us expected that there was going to be a correction and that we would have to reduce the amount of shopping space in the U.S. Things like department stores and malls are particularly declining. But the pandemic has certainly accelerated that. And in categories like apparel, where there was already some headwinds, the pandemic has been a disaster as folks haven't had occasions that they need to wear new apparel for example.
And we have seen that globally the value of mergers and acquisition deals actually rose 15% year on year in the retail sector in 2020. Do you think that will continue into 2021? And how will that really change the landscape of the retail industry?
Yeah, well, I also do think that will continue. It's sort of the close, tricky friend of the bankruptcies is consolidations and mergers. And so what you're essentially seeing is a significant consolidation of retail. The retailers that are thriving tend to be larger retailers that then can acquire more struggling retailers. And what it really means is the retailers have more leverage in their relationships with their brand partners. So if the top 3 grocers in the United States were 38% of Procter & Gamble's business before the pandemic, now maybe they're 46 or 47%, and so they're likely be able to negotiate better trade terms with those brands.
So as we look ahead to hopefully when the pandemic ends or at least becomes more manageable, do you think that this reliance that we've seen on e-commerce will continue, or do you think people will want to come back to the brick and mortar stores?
That's the great question. At the peak of the pandemic, we saw e-commerce adoption accelerate by literally 5 years. We saw sort of the total share of e-commerce sales in the U.S. jump from 15 or 16% to almost 33%, which we wouldn't have predicted happening for at least 5 more years. That's come down a little bit already, and it certainly is going to come down more next year. There's a lot of artificial things in place keeping folks out of stores and forcing them to e-commerce. At the same time, a lot of this e-commerce activity is now going to become permanent. We call these one-way doors. If you had never tried online grocery shopping before and you created an account because of the pandemic, or maybe you bought a Walmart Plus membership or an Instacart membership, then you're likely going to continue to be an e-commerce grocery shopper even after it's completely safe to return to the grocery store. So we certainly think a portion, but not all, of this acceleration of e-commerce is likely to be permanent.
Now, we have seen obviously a number of stores really having to turn to e-commerce, but what about the sectors that have been hurt most by this pivot to online shopping?
Yeah, well, certainly I think the sectors you most don't want to be in is you don't want to be a department store, you don't want to be a mall-based retailer, and you don't want to be an apparel-based retailer. And many stores have 2 or 3 of those attributes, which can be really challenging.